cooperatives and pro agriculture value chain in development. 자, 박수로 맞이해 주시죠.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm very honored and happy to be here. In the interest of time, let me jump straight into the presentation. Hopefully we'll have some time for discussion later. As I prepared this presentation, and I was also reminded by the distinguished moderator that some of it may appear a little complex, so let's discuss it. This is just the wording. And in fact, I realized that I didn't pass my own test, which I call the grandmother test. When I write something, I think of my grandmother, and I think if she understands it, yes, I've done a good job. It has been clear and simple. Now, today, maybe I'm not passing it, but we'll be there to explain. So, thinking of cooperatives, the first thing that I thought was important to point out, as you know, nowadays, cooperatives are just one form of organization in rural areas. Nowadays, you have increasingly different types of farmer organizations like limited liability companies, farm associations, and so on. Yet, cooperatives are still there and they're very important. So I think it is maybe important also for us today to focus a little bit on what is the difference between these different types of organizations. I think the preceding speaker has already pointed out many of them, such as the one member, one vote principle, which is the basic democratic principle of cooperatives. Now, there are many more, and some of them are actually are to the advantage of this type of farm organizations. Other maybe put them at a slight disadvantage. So let us maybe discuss this. The organizers of the conference have asked us to speak about some of the homogeneous issues that cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives all over the world are facing. And I think there are many of them. And what is interesting, in fact, is to find out how different parts of the world, farmers in different parts of the world, cooperatives have responded to some of these issues. And we will see that they've responded in very different ways. And maybe one element of one part of future research could be looking into this a lot more, because in fact I don't think there's enough research on how farmer cooperatives, cooperative movements, governments, policy frameworks have been responding. Now, I'll go briefly through this presentation, just talking about a little bit about IFAD's experience with agricultural value chain development, and then also, as I said, about some of the new tools that we have, new analytical methods. First thing, just to remind us all, is that IFAD does not really have a specific policy on promoting cooperatives. We see cooperatives as one form of farm organization, but in fact we had an evaluation which is done by an independent entity that belongs to IFAD, but that has its own autonomy, which is our independent office of evaluation. And they have recently looked at our portfolio of projects and programs, have found that basically we have been investing in farm organizations that have been formerly cooperatives or that have not been formally cooperatives for the last decades consistently. So basically we look at the values of these organizations and we decide whether to invest in them, whether they're cooperatives or not, but obviously the cooperative values as such are very important to us. Going back to this distinction between farmer organizations and cooperatives, I thought it would be important to remind ourselves that conceptually, cooperatives are actually born as an extension of the family farm. So as we think of family farming today, in 2018, it is quite important to remind ourselves that the logical, if you want, organizational form for modern family farming is the agricultural cooperative. And we can discuss why this is so and will probably remain so. It is mostly related to the specifics of the agricultural sector. Finally, we all know that cooperatives are a special form of organization that in a way embodies a different type of economic development, a different type of agribusiness, even a different type of capitalism, which is maybe more humane, more centered on people themselves. The preceding speaker has already talked about some of the issues with governance, and he also mentioned the fact that, unfortunately, in many countries, cooperatives still suffer from a historically from a relatively bad image. So it is very important that today we make all efforts to possibly update this image, because there's no need to be stuck in the past. Obviously, we have to understand the implications that this image has brought about. He mentioned what has happened after decolonization in many countries, many LDCs, where governments have more or less taken over some of the same policies, which were more or less top-down policies. And they involve quite a great deal of government involvement, direct involvement in cooperative affairs. Now, I think this nowadays is decreasing, and nowadays the autonomy of cooperatives is being more and more respected. And as part of maybe refreshing this image of cooperatives, we need to remind everybody that we're basically talking about business. We're talking about business entities. A particular type of business entity, but it is a business entity. So the government has to play an enabling role. It shouldn't interfere directly. There's a lot of debate in the literature, in fact, about some of the more recent cooperatives and about how genuine they are. I put this in inverted commas because who is there to judge what is a genuine cooperative or what is not a genuine cooperative? Again, as mentioned previously, we have the ICA, International Cooperative Alliance Principles. Universally acknowledged there are 7 of them, of which the democratic member control is just 1. Now, in some countries, these are applied more or less and are enshrined in law and policy more or less. A very striking example is China. I will get to China later on. Again, let's say if we need to boil down the main principles to the essentials, we have to talk about asset ownership, and obviously the membership-based asset ownership and the redistribution of dividends at the end of the year as one of the key principles. Why cooperatives are important, in fact, beyond these specifics, is not different from any type of farm organization that needs economies of scale. Again, the previous presenter has already reminded us why farmers need to get organized. Obviously, maybe the lowest common denominator for getting organized is access to inputs at better prices and marketing of outputs also at better prices. But we also have access to services as a main issue. You know that in many rural areas, public extension services struggle to reach rural communities and rural farmers. So public extension alone is not the solution in many countries. We also need civil society, NGOs, and we especially need private service providers. So you know that the services in the agricultural sectors are many. It's not just agronomic advice, it's land preparation. And increasingly it is business development services, BDS. We usually divide BDS into financial and non-financial. When we talk about value chain development, we want to support farmers to be able to compete in pretty sophisticated food systems. So this means that the business development services part also needs to be improved substantially in terms of the quality of the advice that can be delivered that needs to help farmers achieve better product quality. As I say, at IFAD, we don't have a preconceived notion of working or not farmers, not working with cooperatives. Of course, we look at the situation on the ground. We look at the poverty levels of the agricultural producers involved. And we also need to look at the legal framework. In most countries, cooperatives are legally defined as an entity that is not for making profit. So it's a non-profit making entity. Obviously, if you're talking agribusiness, this can be a serious constraint. So nowadays, I think we have huge opportunities when you think of value chain approaches. What, again, an evaluation of some of our projects and programs has shown us recently is that one of the reasons that cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, are less able to compete for the time being in modern agribusiness is their lack of integration. So they may have the vertical linkages, like the preceding speaker reminded us of the importance of federating horizontally across producers, but they especially need the vertical linkages along the value chain with the processors, transporters, and so on. Nowadays, I think we have a situation whereby cooperatives are increasingly needing to compete with concentration in the food business. As you know, nowadays, in the agribusiness sector, you have fewer and fewer companies controlling larger and larger shares of the market. So these players can obviously afford to put a lot of money into developing their logistics, what used to be called supply chains. But we have other opportunities, and not all of them always appear on, let's say, the radar screen of IFAD, of development agencies, and of policymakers. Some of these structural changes of the agri-food sector and of the food systems worldwide are very interesting opportunities for smallholders, whether they're part of cooperatives or not. Of course, being part of cooperatives makes it easier for them to seize some of these opportunities. I'm thinking in particular of high-value food products. Consumers are increasingly demanding in terms of the quality of what they consume. And, for example, in terms of the traceability, consumers increasingly worldwide want to know where their product comes from, who produced it. So this is an increasing challenge, and obviously cooperatives can assist farmers with this traceability challenge. Another one worth mentioning is the fair trade. It was also mentioned by our president, my president, this morning with respect to a program we're supporting in Papua New Guinea. As you know, fair trade is not really regulated worldwide. It's a self-regulatory system, whereby the typical principles of fair trade is that the buyer reinvests part of the profit into the cooperative. So this is another opportunity that could be more widely exploited, because it is a very interesting arrangement that really leads to a win-win partnership. So lastly, I was told in the interest of time, I need to hurry up. Just to flag some of the issues. Again, the preceding speaker talked about credit. Credit is probably the main issue. Credit, or let's say access to finance. If agricultural cooperatives these days want to compete with the large players that have huge budgets, multi-million-dollar budgets that they can invest in innovation, they need to also solve this issue of getting access to capital. This is what we can call risk capital, meaning that it is capital that can be used for things such as innovation. Now, we have a new generation of cooperatives, which in fact is not that new. It has developed since the 1980s. But in the agricultural sector, it is coming forward just recently, where you basically have an arrangement by which cooperatives allow for partnerships to get access to outside capital. Now, this may be in the form of a subsidiary. You may have a capital-seeking entity as a subsidiary of a cooperative, or it may be by allowing direct participation of outside investors in the cooperative, buying firm equity, which is a slightly more tricky arrangement, but then can also work very well. So basically, we have a two-layer investment structure. We see this now in many countries, as I say, very impressively in China these days. Basically, the idea of being able to access capital or through this new two-layer investment structure is that you get different types of capital that the cooperative can use. At the same time, you stick to your collective decision-making structure. Briefly, I think IFAD has realizes that the presence of agricultural cooperatives varies enormously, not just by country, by region, but also by commodity, we also realize that if you look ironically at the performance, at the success of some of the agricultural cooperatives, the ones that have been doing best are actually the ones that have less public investment. So I think we need to think very carefully about how the public sector should support agricultural investments. We have this issue of so-called elite capture, where cooperatives are not necessarily representing the poorer members of rural society. We have the issue of aging. In some countries, unfortunately, cooperatives are aging and the members hold on to their shares, and there is no rejuvenation of cooperatives. We have very interesting examples of access to inputs that can be mediated by cooperatives through, let's say, enabling policy frameworks, including access to land. And working, for example, with our sister agency here, FAO, we have also often used the FFS, which is the Farmer Field School approach, to basically promote grassroots organizational development of farmer associations, first informally, but usually they grow to become formal, either cooperatives or other types of farmer organizations. Very briefly, these are some of the examples that IFAD has been supporting worldwide. As I said, fair trade, organic agriculture, even biodynamic agriculture can be very interesting opportunities for smallholder farmers in cooperatives because of the very interesting price that they can be paid for their products. We have experience with contract farming, with outgrow schemes. Certain crops lend themselves easily to such outgrow schemes, such as sugar and other similar crops. I mentioned China as a very interesting country in terms of cooperative development. As you know, China has set up what they call dragon head enterprises, which are public enterprises that work with the lower levels of cooperatives on many commodities, on tea, on rice, and so on. But they also have new direct marketing relationships, contract relationships with supermarkets, and also with internet-based platforms, such as the Alibaba-related Taobao platform. In Uzbekistan, we work with different types of businesses that pull the agricultural value chain, which we call leading entities, for want of a better term. Of course, the traditional, in inverted commas, cash crops, such as coffee, such as tea, such as cocoa, are still very important for cooperative development. So coffee-producing cooperatives remain a main element in our support to countries in Latin America. You have fruit growers cooperatives, again, coming back in a major way in Europe. And finally, dairy, milk cooperatives throughout the world, I think, are gaining prominence and are showing us some very innovative configurations in terms of how cooperatives at different levels, at the grassroots, at the federated level, set up their horizontal and especially their vertical linkages. I think I'll stop here in the interest of time, as I've been reminded by the coordinators that I should stop. These are just finally some approaches that are emerging that help us of analyzing the situation in new ways, finding ways of combining, if you want, the traditional analysis, the traditional tools we've been using for agricultural development, and updating them to the recent trends in how food systems are changing. So, for example, nowadays we no longer talk about supply chain and supply chain analysis, but we talk about network analysis, because the whole configuration of most agricultural value chains has become much more complex. So there's a new school of thought which is called net chain analysis, which is a combination of value chain and network analysis. And there are many different tools that we can all use to make sure that we get a much better grasp of the situation and that we can find the best ways of supporting agricultural cooperatives to compete in the agribusiness sector in 2018. Thank you very much.